Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden among the silent tombstones? In a forgotten cemetery, where shadows linger long after the sun has set, and the wind carries whispers of those who've passed, something unsettling stirs. This is a place where the rules of the living no longer apply, where each grave seems to hold more than just memories. Imagine a place where the ground itself feels alive, as if it's holding on to stories that are not ready to rest. They say that in graveyards, the boundary between this world and the next grows thin. Some believe it's a place for peaceful rest, but here, beneath the layers of earth, an unquiet history lies dormant. This isn't just another cemetery, this ground has seen something far beyond our understanding. And it waits for those who dare to wander too close. What would you do, if one night, you found yourself here, alone, with only shadows to keep you company? Would you walk among the graves, hoping to hear nothing but silence? Or would you hear faint whispers? The quiet footsteps of someone. Or something. Watching? I never intended to set foot in Hollowfield Cemetery. But one autumn night, something drew me there. Something I can't explain. As I stepped through the gates, it felt like crossing into another world, a world where the air was thick and time itself seemed to pause. It was silent, deathly silent, yet somehow alive with a tension that made every nerve in my body tighten. The ground beneath me was soft, as if the earth itself was breathing. As I walked further, I could feel something watching me. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, it was just a cemetery. But each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into its grasp, as if it wanted me to stay. Then I saw it. The grave of Margaret Fletcher. She'd been young, they said. Beautiful, with a voice so enchanting that she would sing lullabies for the children of the village. But something happened. No one ever spoke of her death, not in detail. All they said was that she'd been found lying under that tree, her eyes open, looking toward the sky. I didn't know what compelled me to get closer, but as I did, the air grew colder. I could hear something. A soft humming. And that's when I realized it wasn't coming from around me. It was coming from beneath me. I couldn't move. My feet felt rooted to the ground as the melody seemed to seep into my bones. My breath turned to fog in the chill, and I swear, I could feel a presence. It was like she was right there, standing beside me. Watching. I turned around, expecting to see someone. But there was no one. Just rows and rows of silent graves, stretching into the darkness. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow moving between the headstones. I knew I should leave. But something held me there. I felt as if I had crossed a line, as if I had intruded into a world I wasn't meant to see. And then, just when I thought the nightmare was over, I felt it. A cold hand brushing the back of my neck. I did my research before going back to Hollowfield. Maybe it was a way of preparing myself. Or warning myself. The more I read, the more I realize that Hollowfield was unlike any other graveyard. Founded in 1876, Hollowfield Cemetery became the resting place of more than just the departed. It became a holding ground for the tragic, the unexplained. Rumors spread quickly. Of people going missing, of figures moving in the mist. Some claimed it was cursed. A place where sorrow, rage, and unfinished business bound spirits to the earth. In one of the stories, a young man, a gravedigger, disappeared one winter night in 1923. All they found were his scattered tools, lying beside an open grave as if he'd simply vanished. I read these accounts over and over, feeling the fear begin to settle into my bones. And I couldn't help but ask myself, could I do this alone? Would I be able to walk through this place and leave unscathed? Despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I found myself back at Hollowfield. It was almost midnight when I crossed through the gates again, my flashlight casting faint beams into the thick, creeping fog. The air was so cold, it felt like it was pressing down on me. Almost immediately, I felt a strange heaviness. The graves seemed closer, as if they'd moved since my last visit. Shadows lurked between the trees, darting in and out of my sight. I kept glancing back, but no matter how hard I tried to stay focused, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard something. A voice. But it was so quiet, so faint, like a memory trying to speak. I felt a chill settle over me as I moved closer to Margaret Fletcher's grave, drawn by some force I couldn't explain. I knew I shouldn't go any further. But I did. As I looked down at her grave, that's when it started. The soft, humming tune, the same one I'd heard before. It floated on the air, clear yet distant, as if someone was standing right beside me, singing. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I turned to leave, but the sound grew louder, following me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. I could see it, a dark silhouette, as if someone was waiting there, watching me. My heart pounded as I took a step back, but the figure didn't move. I wasn't alone. I felt surrounded, as if the shadows themselves were coming to life. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief flash of light, I saw faces. Pale, empty faces staring at me from between the graves. It was too much. I had to leave. But as I turned, a voice whispered my name. Soft, almost loving. Like someone calling me home. I tried to run, but every path I took seemed to lead me deeper into the cemetery. I could feel them reaching for me. Cold hands brushing against my arms, whispering in my ears. I couldn't breathe. It was as if the ground itself was pulling me down. I froze. There, right in front of me, was a grave with my name. The date of my birth. And today's date. In that moment, I realized. I wasn't just a visitor. I was the next resident. I stumbled through the fog, desperate to escape. My flashlight was flickering, casting fleeting glimpses of the graves, the trees. But no matter how far I ran, the chill clung to me. It felt as though Hollowfield had wrapped itself around me, and every shadow held a watchful eye. I could feel something behind me. But I couldn't look. I couldn't risk seeing what might be staring back. I told myself it was over. That I was safe. But that feeling didn't go away. I could still feel eyes on me, even as I drove away. My rearview mirror caught glimpses of the fog, but something else seemed to flicker just on the edge of sight. I felt a presence, a weight in the car with me. I could hardly breathe, my pulse racing, and that lullaby. It wouldn't stop. I should have felt safe, but that darkness. It felt like the shadows from the graveyard had followed me, filling every corner of my home. And then I heard it. I realized, in that moment, that I may have left Hollowfield Cemetery. But it hadn't left me. It's a place that marks you. A place that never lets go. So if you ever find yourself near Hollowfield Cemetery, remember that some places are meant to be forgotten. Because once you've walked its paths, once you've heard that song, you may never leave it behind. If you made it through this tale, you're braver than most. Not many are willing to face the unknown like that. But here's the question that haunts me. Was I ever really alone in Hollowfield Cemetery? Or did something come back with me? What do you think really happened that night? Do you believe places like Hollowfield can truly keep a part of you? Share your theories in the comments below, and let's see if anyone else has felt the same lingering shadow. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The moon, a pale sliver in the inky sky, cast an eerie glow over the weathered tombstones of the abandoned Elmwood Cemetery. Despite the warnings whispered amongst the townsfolk, I found myself drawn to its desolate beauty on this crisp autumn night. Curiosity, fueled by a dash of youthful recklessness, had led me here. Stories of restless spirits and unexplained occurrences had swirled around Elmwood for generations, making it a forbidden playground for thrill-seeking teenagers like myself. Tonight, I was determined to see for myself if those stories held any truth. As I stepped through the rusted wrought iron gate, a shiver ran down my spine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the mournful hoot of an owl perched on a crumbling mausoleum. The air felt charged with an unseen energy, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. The first thing I noticed was a lone figure hunched over a freshly dug grave. Its silhouette was obscured by the darkness, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach. As I drew closer, the figure straightened up, revealing a tall, gaunt man with wild, bloodshot eyes. He wore a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in deep shadow. Before I could react, the man spoke in a low, raspy voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You shouldn't be here, child," he rasped, his words laced with a strange urgency. "This place isn't meant for the living." I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to see. I heard stories." The man cut me off with a chilling laugh that echoed through the graveyard. "Stories are one thing," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "but some things are better left undisturbed." Ignoring his warning, I pushed past him, driven by a morbid curiosity. The deeper I ventured, the denser the fog became, swirling around my legs like a living entity. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the unsettling crunch of dead leaves under my feet. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. My heart lurched, and I spun around, searching for the source of the sound. The old man was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the graveyard. I stumbled through the fog, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The screams continued, echoing through the graveyard, closer this time. Tears streamed down my face as I tripped and fell, scraping my hands on the rough earth. Scrambling to my feet, I pushed on, adrenaline fueling my every step. I had a feeling I wasn't alone anymore, that something unseen was chasing me. Finally, I reached the rusty gate, my vision blurry from tears and terror. With a Herculean effort, I pushed it open and stumbled out of the graveyard, slamming the gate shut behind me. I ran blindly through the night, not daring to look back. The chilling screams faded behind me, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after the graveyard disappeared from sight. I never returned to Elmwood Cemetery. The memory of that night, the chilling encounter with the old man, and the terrifying screams remain etched in my memory, a constant reminder of the secrets that lie hidden in the darkness. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the weathered tombstones of Elmwood Cemetery. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the inky sky. I should have known better than to wander here alone, especially on a night like this. Curiosity, fueled by a dash of youthful recklessness, had led me to this desolate place, a graveyard steeped in local legend and whispered tales of the supernatural. In the heart of the old graveyard, where moonlight struggles to touch the ground and the air is thick with forgotten whispers, something watches. It's a place where time stands still and the dead aren't as silent as they should be. Tonight, we take you into the darkness where one step too close can awaken what should never be disturbed. Imagine an old cemetery, tucked away on the outskirts of a town that most have long forgotten. The gates are wrought iron, cold to the touch and worn with age, a testament to the decades of grief they have held within. The trees, twisted and gnarled, stand like silent sentinels, their branches stretching over crumbling tombstones carved with names that have faded into obscurity. It is said that at the heart of this place lies something more than the memories of those buried beneath the earth. Whispers pass through generations, stories told in hushed voices of unmarked graves and movements in the fog. But what if these stories were more than just tales to scare children? What if, as the moon drifts behind the clouds and the wind stills, you could feel that deep, unsettling presence, a cold that seeps not just into your bones, but into the core of your being? Tonight, we bring you a true account of a place where reality bends and the veil between the living and the departed grows thin. A story of those who dared to trespass and the things they witnessed, things that defy explanation and cling to the mind like a shadow you can't shake. Settle in, but beware, this is not a story to be taken lightly. For once you hear it, you may find that darkness holds more than just the absence of light. It holds memories, voices, and a sense that something is watching. Listen closely, for this tale will stay with you long after the lights go out, long after the noise of the day fades, and silence fills the room. This is the story of the graveyard where silence speaks, where the night holds its breath, and the line between the living and the lost begins to blur. This story takes place in an old, forgotten graveyard, nestled far beyond the bustle of the nearest town. A place untouched by the passage of time, where ivy weaves around cracked headstones and nature claims its hold in a relentless, quiet grip. To those who pass by, it might seem like just another resting place of the past, but for those who know its story, it's a gateway to something far more unsettling. The graveyard had become the subject of whispered tales, accounts that went beyond superstition. Night guards assigned to patrol its perimeter told of sights that made their blood run cold, shadowy figures that darted between graves, strange, bone-chilling laughter that seemed to come from the earth itself. Urban explorers, brave or perhaps reckless enough to venture inside after dark, returned with stories of whispering voices following them, soft cries echoing through the air, and flashes of light that had no source. Locals spoke of the eerie feeling that crept up their spines as they walked past on moonless nights. Some claimed they heard their own names being called in a voice that matched the tone of a long-dead relative. Others swore that the air grew heavy, almost suffocating, the closer they dared to get. But tonight, we do more than just recount these stories. We will walk you through the events as they unfolded, true accounts that blur the line between fact and fear. You will hear the chilling tale of the night guard who faced what he could only describe as an encounter with the unknown, the explorers who left with more than just scratches and torn clothes, and the locals who still refuse to speak of the things they've seen. Prepare yourself for an immersive journey into a place where silence is more than the absence of sound, it's the sound of watching, waiting, and remembering. This is not just a story. It's a mosaic of accounts that defy logic, leaving only one question behind: when you step into a place where the dead rest, what wakes up? The graveyard had a history as layered as the moss-covered tombstones that marked its grounds. Established in the mid-1800s, it was meant to be a peaceful resting place for a town that once thrived. But as decades passed and prosperity waned, the town was left behind, and with it, the graveyard became a relic of forgotten days. Stories began to cling to it like the fog that rolled in each evening, a veil that seemed to separate it from the living world. There were tales of unmarked graves, hurried burials after outbreaks of sickness, and the names of the lost scratched hastily onto wooden crosses that decayed with time, leaving no trace of who they were. The first whispers of trouble began after a series of disappearances around the late 1800s. It was said that 3 grave diggers went missing, their tools left behind as if they had stepped into the darkness and never returned. Their absence was chalked up to accidents or men running off to escape debts, but those who worked the grounds spoke in hushed tones of strange echoes and shadows moving under the moonlight. Years later, when funding was scarce and most of the town had moved on, the task of guarding this desolate place fell to a handful of brave souls. Among them was Thomas Hargrove, a retired soldier who had taken up the job for extra income. To him, at first, it was just another shift, a routine job watching over a place where only the past was buried. But Thomas would soon come to realize that the past was not content to stay buried. It started subtly. On his third night, Thomas stood under the old, wrought iron lamppost at the graveyard's entrance, its light flickering like a dying flame. A chill ran down his spine, the kind that seems to carry an unseen weight. He dismissed it as nothing more than the autumn air seeping through his coat. But then, the whispering began, soft at first, like the murmur of a conversation just out of earshot. He strained to listen, the silence so complete that he could hear the thud of his heartbeat. But there was no one there. As he turned to continue his rounds, the cold intensified, the type that seeped beneath his skin, numbing his hands and quickening his breath. A shadow, tall and angular, shifted just beyond the reach of the lampost's glow. Thomas squinted, his eyes narrowing, searching for what could have cast such a figure. He stepped forward, the gravel crunching underfoot, and the shadow disappeared as if it had never been there. He hesitated. Was it the flicker of the light playing tricks on him, or was there something else out there, hidden in the tangle of leaning headstones and creeping ivy? Before he could take another step, the whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. This time, it was unmistakable, it spoke his name. The wind stilled, and an unnatural silence fell over the graveyard, pressing down on him like the weight of unseen eyes. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, the echo of his name still ringing in the night. He tried to shake off the feeling, rationalize it as exhaustion, the tricks of an overactive mind. But as he would soon learn, this was only the beginning. What he had thought was a place for the dead to rest was something far different, something that listened, that remembered, and that had just begun to show itself. It was a week after Thomas's first encounter that the graveyard began to reveal more of its secrets. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that fills the air before a storm breaks. Thomas patrolled the path, his flashlight casting long, narrow beams that cut through the dark like a fragile lifeline. Each step seemed louder than the last, the crunch of gravel under his boots reverberating in the emptiness. As he approached the oldest section of the cemetery, where headstones leaned as if whispering to each other and ivy choked the names long forgotten, a feeling of unease crept over him. His eyes fell on the weathered stone of the mausoleum, a structure he had always avoided with an unconscious wariness. The air was colder here, biting and unforgiving. Then he saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing perfectly still near the arched entrance of the mausoleum. The moonlight seemed to bend around it, casting the stone in an unnatural shadow. For a heartbeat, Thomas froze, his breath held tight in his chest as he strained to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure did not move, its form dark and featureless, like an ink stain against the cold, gray stone. He blinked, willing his eyes to adjust, convinced that exhaustion was making him see things. The flashlight beam wavered in his trembling hand, sweeping across the mausoleum's entrance and catching only stone. The figure was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The whispering, faint and echoing, seemed to dissipate into the night, leaving him in a silence so profound that it felt unnatural. Thomas took a step back, his heart thundering in his chest. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the light, the product of long shifts and tired eyes. But as he turned to leave, a sharp sound cracked behind him, like the snap of brittle wood. He spun around, the flashlight beam catching nothing but the solemn faces of the headstones and the gaping maw of the mausoleum's entrance, now seeming deeper and darker than ever before. Thomas forced a laugh, brittle and hollow, his breath visible in the sudden chill. He muttered under his breath, dismissing it as a product of an overworked mind. Yet as he walked away, he couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on him, following him, watching his every move. That night, sleep was no refuge. He woke more than once, haunted by the memory of that shadowy figure and the whispers that called from the silence. Days passed, but the unease did not. The memory of the figure haunted him, a dark silhouette burned into the corner of his mind. And then it happened again, only this time, it was clearer, more real. It was close to midnight when Thomas, walking his usual path, caught sight of the same shadow near the mausoleum, but this time it moved. It shifted slowly, as if turning its head to meet his gaze, and for a moment, it felt as though he was staring into a void, an emptiness that reached out to him, cold and consuming. This time, there was no mistaking it. He wasn't tired, and he wasn't imagining it. Something was there, and it knew he was watching. Panic surged through him as the whispers returned, louder and closer, encircling him in an invisible grasp. He stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling across the path, the beam flickering as it came to a stop. The shadow remained, unmoving, as if daring him to come closer. Heart pounding and breath ragged, Thomas scrambled to retrieve his light, never taking his eyes off the mausoleum. But when he looked up, the figure was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence and the echo of whispers that seemed to drift into the night air, taking with them a part of his courage that he would never reclaim. As the days turned to weeks, Thomas's unsettling experiences grew more frequent and more intense. What began as fleeting shadows and whispers morphed into an array of phenomena that defied explanation. The graveyard itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if some unseen force had awakened, growing bolder with each passing night. The first sign that things were escalating came on a particularly cold night. The air was sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. Thomas paced the familiar paths, his flashlight a thin, wavering beam of safety in the dark. But the silence was deceptive. From behind him, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed softly on the gravel. He spun around, his light slicing through the dark only to find an empty path stretching into the shadows. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. The next morning, Thomas noticed something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. Several tombstones, ones he passed nightly, appeared to have shifted positions. The heavy slabs, rooted deep into the earth for decades, were now angled differently, some leaning forward as if to watch his path, others pointing in directions that made no sense. He questioned the groundskeeper, an elderly man who had tended to the cemetery since his youth, but received only a puzzled shake of the head and a muttered warning, "This ground holds more than bones." Then came the symbols. It began with simple scratches in the dirt, nothing more than odd scrawls that Thomas initially dismissed as animal tracks or the work of trespassing teenagers. But over time, the symbols grew in complexity, carved into the sides of tombstones and the base of the mausoleum. They looked ancient, almost runic, their jagged lines forming patterns that felt unnatural, even hostile. Thomas felt a chill each time he passed them, as if they were trying to tell him something he couldn't understand. The stories began to spread. One night, a young couple, known for their thrill-seeking nighttime visits to haunted places, came running out of the cemetery, pale and breathless. They told anyone who would listen about seeing a man in a dark cloak gliding between the headstones, disappearing into thin air when they tried to follow. The fear in their eyes was real, and soon others came forward with their own stories. An elderly woman who claimed to hear her late husband's voice calling her name from beyond the iron gate, a local teen who insisted she saw handprints appear on the frosted windows of the old caretaker's shed. The night that broke Thomas's resolve began like any other. He had taken to humming softly as he walked, a habit that helped drown out the whispers and keep his mind focused. But that night, the silence felt different, heavier, charged. As he rounded the bend near the oldest row of graves, his flashlight caught something that made his blood freeze. A tombstone that had been clean and unmarked the day before was now carved with the same cryptic symbols that had been appearing. He leaned in, the hair on his neck standing as a sudden chill gripped him. The sound of footsteps began again, slow and deliberate, circling him. His breath quickened as the whispers returned, clearer now and overlapping, as though a dozen unseen voices were chanting just beyond the edge of his hearing. He called out into the dark, his voice trembling, but there was no answer, only the whispers rising in urgency. Thomas turned sharply, his flashlight catching movement, just the briefest flicker of something shifting behind a tree. The beam followed, shaking, catching nothing but the moss-covered bark. But then, there was the sound of scratching, deep and deliberate, as though nails were etching into stone. He backed away, heart racing, as the wind picked up, carrying a distant, mournful cry that echoed through the graveyard. It was the final sign he needed. That night, Thomas handed in his resignation. As he walked out for the last time, he glanced back one final time, only to see a shadow, tall and unmoving, standing by the mausoleum. It was watching him leave, as if bidding farewell or warning that he would never truly be free of what he'd seen. The night that would seal Thomas's fate began much like the others, but there was something unspoken in the air, a weight that pressed down on him from the moment he stepped through the iron gate. The wind was restless, sighing through the branches and rattling the brittle leaves clinging stubbornly to life. The chill was sharper that night, stinging like ice against his skin as he made his rounds. The graveyard seemed almost alive, as though the stones were watching, waiting for something. Thomas felt the eyes on him, silent and unblinking, hidden in the cracks of ancient stone and the shadows cast by gnarled trees. He clutched his flashlight tighter, the metal cold and unforgiving in his shaking hand. His breath came out in quick, visible puffs as he moved past the mausoleum, its stone facade now carved with symbols so deep they seemed to writhe under the beam of his light. And then he heard it, a voice that made his blood turn to ice. It was soft at first, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. "Thomas." The voice called, stretching out the syllables in a way that was both familiar and unnatural. He stopped, turning slowly as his heart pounded against his ribs. It was his mother's voice, warm and tender, calling him home like she had when he was a boy. But that was impossible. His mother had passed away years before, and no sound should have been able to carry that tone, that painful, loving note, in this place of stone and shadow. "Hello?" Thomas's voice cracked, the word barely escaping his lips. The flashlight shook in his hand as he swept it around, catching glimpses of bent headstones, gaping like silent mouths under the thin veil of light. The wind died suddenly, as if holding its breath, and the silence that followed was deafening. The voice returned, closer this time, cutting through the stillness. "Thomas, come here," it whispered, tinged with a soft cadence that was unmistakably his mother's. Panic surged through him, an icy tide that tightened around his chest. He backed away, eyes darting across the rows of graves that seemed to stretch endlessly around him. The mausoleum loomed in the corner of his vision, its shadow long and dark, as if the structure itself were stretching to reach him. It was then that the whispering started again, this time surrounding him, overlapping and merging into a single, suffocating chant. The sound was deafening, a chorus of voices that clawed at the edge of sanity. He stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling across the ground, casting frantic, spinning beams of light across the graveyard. For a brief moment, the beam illuminated a face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face staring at him from the shadow of a leaning headstone, before flickering out into darkness. The breath caught in Thomas's throat as he staggered backward. A low, grinding noise, like stone against stone, rumbled behind him. He turned slowly, the muscles in his legs frozen with fear. The mausoleum's door, locked for as long as anyone could remember, was now ajar, its ancient hinges creaking as it opened wider. From within, the darkness seemed to pulse, alive with movement. And then, he heard it again. "Thomas, come here," the voice called, echoing from inside the mausoleum. This time, it was accompanied by the faintest hint of sobbing, like a plea that tugged. In the days following Thomas's harrowing experience, whispers spread through the small town like wildfire. Locals were drawn to the graveyard, each eager to share their own stories, recounting eerie incidents that had long been dismissed as mere folklore. The once quiet cemetery transformed into a focal point for thrill-seekers, ghost hunters, and curious onlookers, all eager to uncover the truth hidden beneath its hallowed ground. News of Thomas's ordeal reached paranormal investigators who specialized in uncovering the supernatural. Armed with equipment designed to detect anomalies, they arrived at the graveyard, ready to probe its secrets. The group set up base near the mausoleum, their voices blending with the rustling leaves, their equipment humming softly in anticipation. The lead investigator, a woman named Lisa, was known for her keen intuition and extensive knowledge of the paranormal. She explained to the camera, "We've heard reports of electromagnetic disturbances in this area. The stories of ghostly sightings, unexplained sounds, and even feelings of being watched have drawn us here. We're hoping to capture evidence that something beyond the physical is at play." As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The air thickened with anticipation, and the shadows lengthened, casting a shroud over the tombstones. The team began their investigation, splitting into pairs to cover more ground. As they moved through the graveyard, the equipment began to react. "Over here," shouted one of the team members, pointing to an area where the EMF meter was fluctuating wildly. They gathered around, peering into the darkness. The camera zoomed in on the meter, its needle bouncing erratically. As they recorded their findings, the tension mounted. Just then, a chill swept through the group, palpable and immediate. The sound of footsteps echoed from the far end of the cemetery, heavy and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was walking among the graves. They turned their flashlights toward the sound, hearts racing, but there was nothing there. The footsteps faded, swallowed by the night, leaving only the sound of their hurried breaths. As the night wore on, the team continued their exploration, capturing strange readings and unexplainable occurrences. Lisa held up her spirit box, which began to crackle with static. She asked, "Is anyone here with us?" The device crackled, and a voice emerged, faint but unmistakable, calling out, "Help! Me!" With mounting evidence, the investigators grew more excited, but an undercurrent of fear hung in the air. They reconvened at the mausoleum, where they shared their findings and discussed the implications of the previous night's events. As they spoke, a dark figure flickered in the corner of one investigator's camera, a moment captured in time that no one could explain. The next day, the footage went viral, and the graveyard became a sensation. Social media buzzed with posts and videos, drawing even more curious visitors and thrill-seekers. Some claimed to have felt a cold presence, Others reported strange sounds or fleeting glimpses of figures darting between tombstones. In the wake of these sightings, the local news reported on the increasing activity, adding fuel to the fire. Interviews with locals revealed a pattern of disturbances stretching back generations. They spoke of the cemetery as a place of restless spirits, where the past refused to stay buried. As curiosity turned to obsession, the once peaceful resting place became a site of frenzied investigation and haunting experiences. The whispers that had once been confined to Thomas now echoed through the community, each person adding to the narrative, feeding the shadows that lurked just beyond the light. The graveyard, once a place of quiet reflection, transformed into a battleground for those seeking to understand the unexplainable, where every rustle of leaves and flicker of shadows hinted at secrets waiting to be unveiled. As the investigation continued and interest grew, a local historian named Mr. Collins stepped forward, eager to shed light on the graveyard's dark past. With a stack of old records and newspaper clippings in hand, he believed the truth behind the disturbances was deeply rooted in the cemetery's history, a history few were aware of. Collins began, this graveyard was established in the 1800s, during a time of great turmoil. The town was struck by a devastating epidemic, resulting in a rapid increase in deaths. Many bodies were buried here without proper identification, their graves unmarked and forgotten. Local lore suggests that some of these souls have never found peace. He explained how, in the depths of tragedy, it was not uncommon for the deceased to be buried in mass graves, a desperate attempt to contain the spread of disease. There are records of mass burials during the peak of the epidemic, and some say that the spirits of those lost linger, unable to rest, he continued. They are drawn to the living, seeking recognition, remembrance, and justice. Intrigued by Collins' revelations, the paranormal investigators delved deeper into the town's lore, uncovering tales of a watchful spirit, a guardian said to roam the cemetery, ensuring that the forgotten were not entirely lost to time. According to local legend, this spirit was believed to be one of the grave diggers who had worked tirelessly during the epidemic. His soul was bound to the earth, forever watching over the restless dead. Local elders spoke of this spirit with a mixture of reverence and fear, claiming that he appeared to those who entered the graveyard with disrespect or ill intentions. They warned that he was protective of the graves, often manifesting as a shadowy figure, ensuring that the stories of those buried within were never forgotten. One woman, a lifelong resident, recalled, "I've seen him, or at least I think I have. It was late at night, and I was walking my dog. I felt a chill, and there he was, a tall figure, just watching. I ran home, and I've never gone back since." These accounts of the watchful spirit echoed the experiences of Thomas and the investigators. The whispers he heard, the shadows he saw, seemed to connect not just to the present but to a history woven into the very fabric of the ground he walked upon. It was as if the spirits were calling out, urging the living to acknowledge their existence. As the pieces began to fall into place, the investigators compiled their findings, presenting them to the town in a special meeting held at the local community center. They shared the stories, the historical context, and the evidence they had gathered. The room was filled with townsfolk, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear as the chilling tales unfolded before them. Collins stood before them, passionately recounting the history of the graveyard. "This is not just a place of death, it is a place of memory. We must respect those who came before us and acknowledge their pain. We cannot allow their stories to fade into silence." The audience sat in rapt attention, realizing that the graveyard held more than just bones, it held the weight of history, the echoes of lives lost, and the spirits that yearned for acknowledgement. The community began to shift, with many pledging to honor the memory of those buried there, advocating for the restoration and preservation of the site, and vowing to share the stories of the forgotten. As the community embraced the past, the reports of strange occurrences began to wane. The whispers that had once filled the air softened, transformed from a haunting chorus into a gentle reminder of those who had come before. The watchful spirit remained, still a guardian of the graves, but now viewed with respect rather than fear. In uncovering the truth, they had not only brought understanding to the present but had also forged a deeper connection with their past, allowing both the living and the dead to find a measure of peace in the twilight of their stories. Narrator, calm, contemplative tone, as we draw the curtains on this tale, we are left with the lingering echoes of Thomas's story and the profound truths unearthed in this forgotten graveyard. The experiences of the night guard, once dismissed as mere fatigue or figments of imagination, have now woven themselves into the fabric of the community's understanding of their own history. For those who choose to visit this cemetery at night, the guard's tale serves as a poignant reminder: the past is not merely a shadow that fades with time. Instead, it is a living entity, filled with voices longing to be heard. Each shadow that flits among the tombstones and every whisper carried by the wind speaks to a history rich with emotion, tragedy, and a desire for remembrance. As we reflect on the events that unfolded, we must ask ourselves, are there places where the past refuses to rest? Where the weight of unresolved stories clings to the air, whispering to those brave enough to listen? This graveyard stands as a testament to that question, its stones a reminder of lives once lived, hearts once broken, and spirits still seeking solace. With every visit, we invite the unknown and honor the memory of those who walked this earth before us. The lessons we learn from such places remind us to tread softly and with respect, for we are never truly alone. The echoes of the past linger just beyond the veil, waiting for us to acknowledge them. If you found this story spine-chilling and thought-provoking, I encourage you to share your own experiences. Leave a comment below about the most haunted place you've ever heard of or visited. What stories do those places hold? And remember, if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling tales, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an eerie story. Your adventure into the world of the unexplained has just begun. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious. Stay tuned for our next tale, a story even darker than this one.